If someone had told me 30 years ago that I would walk away from the skyline of Chicago to settle in a quiet town for love, I would have laughed. I had everything a man in his 30s could dream of. A thriving career, respect in the investment world, and the means to live on my own terms. But one promise and one woman changed the entire course of my life. Today, at 65, I look back and see how that choice cost me everything I once built. I turned my father-in-law's dying construction company into a multi-million-dollar empire. I helped him rise from the edge of bankruptcy to become a name celebrated across the Midwest. And then, when his pockets overflowed and his pride grew taller than the towers we built together, he decided I was expendable. What he never realized was that the man who built his fortune could also take it apart, piece by piece. Before we continue, please subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me from which country you are listening from, and what would you do if the family you saved decided to erase your name from their success? When I was young, success came to me like a tide that never stopped rising. I was raised on the south side of Chicago by a mechanic father and a mother who worked long hours at a local diner. They were ordinary people who believed in extraordinary work. My father used to tell me, "Sam, a man's worth lies in what he creates, not what he inherits." Those words burned into my mind and guided me through every decision I ever made. I worked through college, studied finance at Northwestern, and graduated with honors. By the time I turned 32, I was already closing deals worth tens of millions. Money was not the reward for me. It was the game itself, the logic, the precision, the satisfaction of turning risk into victory. That world defined me until the day I met her. Her name was Eleanor Mercer, the daughter of Robert Mercer, who owned a small construction company in the heart of Missouri. I met her at a business conference in Chicago. I was there to speak about sustainable infrastructure investments when I noticed her in the front row. Unlike everyone else scribbling notes, she simply watched, her expression calm yet confident. After the talk, she approached me. Instead of praising my presentation, she challenged it. "Do you really believe that success belongs only to the ones who build from scratch?" she asked. That single question started a conversation that lasted through the evening, over coffee, and eventually into a bond that reshaped my life. Eleanor was unlike anyone I had known in my polished corporate circle. She was intelligent, idealistic, and unafraid to question everything. She spoke about her father's business, Mercer Builders, which had once been a respected name but was now buried under millions in debt. "My father will never ask for help," she told me one evening. "He still thinks hard work alone can fix what time is already broken." There was pain in her voice when she said it, and I remember promising her I would help however I could. I did not know then that those words would lead me down a road that would take decades to walk back from. We married 2 years later. The wedding was small but beautiful, held at her family's estate outside Springfield. I still remember the way she looked walking toward me that day, her smile soft and certain, the kind of smile that makes a man believe in forever. I thought I was building a family. Instead, I was walking into a house already built on loyalty to one name, Mercer. After our wedding, Eleanor told me the truth about her father's business. Mercer Builders was drowning. The company was 3 months away from foreclosure, projects unfinished, contracts terminated, and employees leaving by the dozen. I could have written a check and bought him time, but I was foolish enough to believe I could do more than that. I believed I could rebuild it from the ground up, turn it into something stronger. So, I made a decision that shocked everyone who knew me. I resigned from my firm in Chicago, packed up our apartment, and moved to Springfield. My colleagues thought I had lost my mind. "You're giving up partnerships and power for a small-town family firm?" one of them asked. I smiled and said, "Sometimes, loyalty is worth more than leverage." When I arrived at Mercer Builders, the reality was far worse than Eleanor had described. The offices were silent, invoices stacked on desks, and the workers moved like ghosts. Robert Mercer, my new father-in-law, met me in the hallway with a handshake that was colder than the marble floor beneath us. "You think you can save this place?" he asked. His tone carried no faith, only resentment. He was a proud man who had built his company from scratch, but pride had blinded him to the fact that his empire was already falling apart. I spent the next months living out of spreadsheets and coffee cups. I woke before dawn, studied contracts, called every supplier I could find, and used every contact from my Chicago years to buy Robert's company a second chance. I turned his $200,000 debt into a $5 million restructuring deal. I secured investors who saw potential in clean infrastructure and green housing. Slowly, Mercer Builders began to breathe again. The workers returned, paychecks were issued on time, and by the second year, we were back in profit. By the fifth, Robert Mercer was sitting on a portfolio worth over $30 million. He began appearing in trade magazines, giving interviews about his vision, while I stood quietly behind the scenes. At first, it did not bother me. I told myself that humility was part of love. But the longer I stayed, the clearer it became that I was not one of them. Every success was a Mercer success. Every project signed carried only their family's name. I was the outsider who fixed their mistakes and made them wealthy again, but never one of their own. I told myself it was fine, that I did it for Eleanor. I convinced myself that my reward was her pride in me. Yet sometimes, when I came home late, I would see her standing by the window of our house, looking out toward the company yard where her father's name shone on the new building sign. And I could not help wondering if she was proud of me or only proud that her family had been saved. 7 years passed. Mercer Builders was no longer a struggling local firm. It had become a regional powerhouse with multi-million-dollar contracts across Illinois and Missouri. Robert Mercer was now a revered businessman, his face plastered across magazines as the self-made man who had turned failure into fortune. I sat beside him at banquets, listening to him talk about perseverance and hard work, and I would smile like the dutiful son-in-law, applauding along with the crowd. Deep inside, though, something cold had started to grow, a quiet awareness that my sacrifices had become invisible. The breaking point came at the Springfield Business Gala, a night meant to honor Robert Mercer as Entrepreneur of the Year. The lights, the music, the champagne. It was all a celebration of a story that erased me. When he stepped on stage, the applause was thunderous. He smiled, took the award, and began his speech. "I owe this success to my son, Nathan Mercer, who will carry the family vision into the future." The crowd erupted again. I froze. My name was not mentioned. My contribution, my years of labor, the empire I had built for him, vanished with a single sentence. Nathan, who had just returned from London with a degree and an ego, stood there basking in praise while I sat in the shadows. That night, as Robert raised his glass, I realized that I was not family. I was a tool, polished and used until they no longer needed it. I smiled through the applause, shaking hands with people who would never know my name. But inside, I made a promise to myself. If they wanted to forget me, I would make sure they remembered what I had built when it was gone. That realization did not arrive with anger, but with an eerie calm. Betrayal does not always come like a storm. Sometimes it comes like a quiet breeze through a closed window, so subtle you almost convince yourself it is not there. For weeks after that gala, I moved through the Mercer Builders' offices like a ghost haunting the halls I had once brought back to life. Every blueprint, every contract, every financial report bore the marks of my work. Yet I began to notice how those documents now carried only the Mercer family signature. The stationery had changed too. The letterhead that once read Mercer Builders, restructured by Samuel Drayton, strategic advisor, had been quietly replaced with Mercer Group, a family legacy. That single word, legacy, was a statement. It meant they had already written me out of the story. Robert Mercer's attitude shifted in small ways first. He stopped consulting me before board meetings. He began hosting private discussions with his son Nathan, who had returned from London only a year earlier, full of new theories and shallow ambition. Nathan was everything his father wanted to see in a man: young, bloodline, confident, and nothing the company actually needed. He spoke in buzzwords and projected charm, but beneath the polish, there was no understanding of how real business was done. I had spent decades turning chaos into order. Yet now I was being quietly moved aside by a man who had never faced a single day of financial struggle. I remember one particular meeting in vivid detail. It was late afternoon, the boardroom filled with the dull hum of a projector, as I presented a proposal to expand our clean infrastructure contracts across 3 states. It was a plan that could have secured us another $50 million in revenue over 5 years. Halfway through my explanation, Nathan leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Why don't we shift toward commercial real estate instead?" he interrupted. "Shopping centers, mixed-use complexes, that's where the real profit is." His tone carried the arrogance of someone who had never seen a construction site or balanced a quarterly budget. Robert nodded approvingly, as if the boy had just unveiled a stroke of genius. I paused, the silence heavy enough to make the air itself feel brittle. "Commercial development carries risk when the economy slows," I replied evenly. "Sustainability has stability. You cannot feed growth on impulse." But it did not matter. Robert only glanced at his son and said, "Let him try something new, Sam. The world belongs to the young now." That moment told me everything I needed to know. I had given this man my loyalty, my knowledge, my years, and in return he was handing the empire I built to his son like a trophy. I could have walked away then, but I did not. Not because of pride, but because I still believed that Eleanor might see what her father was doing. She had always been my balance, my quiet defender when Robert grew impatient or dismissive. Yet even she had begun to change. Our conversations at home had turned polite but distant, as if she were measuring her words. I could see in her eyes that she was torn between love and loyalty, and family always wins that war. The months that followed felt like standing in quicksand. The more I struggled to steady what I had built, the deeper I sank into invisibility. Employees who once sought my guidance now hesitated before approaching me, afraid of how the Mercers might perceive it. My assistant, a loyal woman named Margaret Hill, whispered to me one evening after hours, "They are restructuring again, Mr. Drayton. There are rumors they want to remove your department entirely." I thanked her, though the words hardly surprised me. Robert had always been too proud to confront me directly, so he did what small men often do. He hid behind paperwork and silent decisions. Still, I continued to work. Each morning I arrived before sunrise, combed through the numbers, adjusted strategies, and signed off on pending projects, even as the shadows lengthened around me. I told myself that effort could still overcome arrogance. Then one morning, a notice arrived on my desk. Effective immediately, all financial and strategic operations will report to Vice President Nathan Mercer. It was written in the stiff language of formality, but it carried the weight of exile. I had been officially sidelined. That night, I sat alone in my home office, staring at the framed photographs on the shelf. My father's workshop, my graduation day, Eleanor and I on our wedding morning. It was strange how success and ruin could coexist in the same room. Eleanor came in quietly and placed her hand on my shoulder. "You should rest, Sam," she said softly. Her voice held affection, but also fatigue. "Your father is doing what he thinks is best for the company." I turned to look at her, and for a moment I searched for the woman who once challenged me across a coffee table, the woman who had once believed in building something together. But what I saw was someone who had learned to live in the shadow of her family's name. "Do you think this is right?" I asked quietly. "After everything we've done?" She hesitated. "It is not about right or wrong," she said. "It is about keeping the company alive for the next generation." Then she left the room, and I realized that she had already chosen her side. The following weeks were a blur of silence and forced politeness. Nathan strutted through the offices as if he had invented the very business he was now steering toward danger. He replaced experienced managers with young acquaintances from London who treated the company like a playground for experiments. I tried to advise him once, to warn him that some of his decisions would backfire. He laughed, saying, "Sam, you have done great things for us, but times are changing. You should relax and let me lead." I nodded, hiding the anger boiling beneath my calm. I had learned that men who underestimate you are the easiest to destroy, because they never see it coming. The tipping point arrived during a quarterly board meeting that should have been routine. I presented an update on our infrastructure division, outlining risks and opportunities, as I always did. But halfway through, Robert interrupted. "We will not be continuing this division," he announced. "Nathan and I have decided to consolidate resources into our commercial ventures. Sam, you have done enough for this company. It is time you enjoy some peace." The words, "You have done enough," echoed through the room like an insult disguised as praise. Around the table, heads turned away, unwilling to meet my eyes. Even Margaret avoided my gaze. I sat still, my hands folded, listening to the man I had saved strip me of my purpose with. The calm cruelty of someone who believed gratitude was a debt already paid. I did not respond. I thanked them politely, gathered my papers, and walked out of the boardroom. In the hallway, I paused for a moment, listening to the muffled voices behind the door. Laughter followed, faint but unmistakable. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I was not angry anymore. I was awake. That night, I returned home to an empty house. Eleanor was visiting her parents, something she had been doing more often lately. The quiet felt heavier than usual, pressing against the walls like a confession. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began compiling every document, every record, every signature connected to Mercer Builders. Contracts, bank statements, project files. I archived them all into an encrypted drive under my own control. I told myself it was for protection, but part of me already knew it was the first move in a longer game. I had built their empire once. Now I was preparing to protect what was rightfully mine when they tried to erase me entirely. As I worked through the night, the words Robert had spoken earlier kept replaying in my mind. You have done enough. He was wrong. I had only just begun. In the weeks that followed, I moved quietly, careful not to attract attention. Outwardly, I appeared calm, even obedient, attending meetings, nodding at directives, playing the role of the loyal veteran easing into the background. But beneath that calm, I was building something precise and deliberate. I gathered every piece of data that traced back to my work: the financial models, strategic frameworks, client contracts, and patented systems that had turned Mercer Builders into the powerhouse it had become. These were not mere records. They were the foundation of the empire, my invisible fingerprints across every ledger. I encrypted them and stored them in a private network. I did not steal anything. I preserved what was mine. Every sleepless night of planning, every hard-won deal, every negotiation that saved that company from ruin, I was ensuring none of it could be rewritten without my name. During the day, I continued to operate as if nothing had changed. Nathan strutted through the corridors, tossing around phrases like rebranding, expansion strategy, and new market philosophy. He was building castles in the air, while the real structure beneath him cracked inch by inch. The suppliers noticed the delays, investors noticed the missing discipline, and employees noticed the confusion. Mercer Builders had once been a machine of precision. Under Nathan, it became a parade of careless ambition. I stayed silent. When they asked for advice, I gave it with clarity and calm. But I never fought to be heard. I knew that arrogance like theirs always collapses under its own weight. Eleanor began to sense my withdrawal. She would ask why I stayed so late in the office or why I stopped attending family dinners. I gave her vague answers. But inside I could feel something irreversible taking shape between us. There was a distance that no amount of conversation could bridge. It was not hostility, only the quiet realization that we no longer spoke the same language. She was now Mrs. Mercer, and I was the man who had carried her family's burdens long enough for them to forget who carried them. Months turned into another year, and the cracks in the company widened. I watched Robert and Nathan make decision after decision driven by vanity, not reason. They poured millions into speculative commercial projects, chasing trends instead of building stability. They replaced loyal employees with people who told them what they wanted to hear. Mercer Builders became Mercer Group, a brand built on ego rather than excellence. Yet the community still praised them. Success has a strange way of blinding people to the truth. They saw the gleaming offices, the luxury cars, the banquets, and they believed the empire was still unshakable. I smiled through it all, waiting. Then came the day I knew would arrive, the day they made their move to erase me completely. It began with an email from Robert. Samuel, please attend the board meeting tomorrow. We will be discussing future leadership transitions. The words were courteous, but the meaning was obvious. The next morning, I walked into the boardroom, wearing the same gray suit I had worn when I first joined Mercer Builders, the same tie Eleanor had given me on our anniversary. The room was filled with familiar faces that had once shown me respect, now too afraid to meet my eyes. Robert sat at the head of the table, his expression practiced, his son seated proudly beside him. "Sam," Robert began, his tone smooth but empty. "You have done more for this company than anyone could have asked for. You saved us when times were hard. You have been a pillar of integrity. But as we move forward, it is time for new leadership. Nathan will be taking over full operational authority, effective immediately." The words washed over me like cold water. Nathan looked at me with a thin smile. trying to mask the triumph in his eyes. "Of course," I said, my voice steady. "If you believe this is best for the company, I will respect that decision." Robert nodded, relieved that there was no confrontation. "We will always value your contributions," he said. I smiled faintly and replied, "I am sure you will." Then I stood, collected my folder, and walked out. No one followed me. No one spoke. That silence was the sound of years of loyalty being discarded in one motion. But what they did not realize was that my silence was not surrender. It was patience. I had spent too many years in this world not to understand that empires collapse from within, not from outside. And I had already placed the first quiet fracture in their foundation. I returned home early that day. Eleanor was in the kitchen, arranging flowers, pretending not to notice the look on my face. "How was the meeting?" she asked softly. I set my briefcase down and answered, "As expected." She turned to face me, her expression uncertain. "They think they are doing what is right, Sam," she said. "Father believes Nathan can carry the company into the future." I looked at her for a long moment before replying, "Do you?" Her silence was my answer. I nodded, then said quietly, "Loyalty without gratitude is the fastest way to destroy everything you think you are protecting." That night, I could not sleep. I sat by my desk, looking at the files I had gathered, the true map of Mercer Builders' financial heart. I had the contracts that kept their investors tied, the performance reports that proved who really drove the company's rise, the intellectual property for every optimization system I had designed. I had spent decades building this machine, and I now held the key to its engine. I knew they would try to push me further out, perhaps even tarnish my name. But I also knew they would soon learn that you cannot erase the architect without tearing down the walls he built. In the weeks that followed, I formally resigned. There was no ceremony, no farewell lunch, only a quiet announcement circulated by email. Within hours, my access to company systems was revoked, my office was cleared, and my name was removed from the corporate website. Robert called it a graceful transition. I called it what it was, cowardice disguised as courtesy. On my final day, I stood outside the Mercer Group headquarters, looking up at the sign that bore their family name. I remembered the first day I had arrived there years ago, full of hope and conviction. Now, the building looked hollow to me, like a monument built over borrowed time. When I walked away that afternoon, I did not feel defeat. I felt release. I had done what I came to do. And now I was free to do what I must. Freedom, as I learned, does not always come with celebration. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wearing the same suit you wore to your own undoing. The first week after I left Mercer Group, Springfield felt strangely calm. The autumn air carried the faint scent of rain and old leaves. For the first time in years, I woke without deadlines pressing against my chest. I spent my mornings walking through the small park near our house, where the maple trees had begun to turn red and gold. To anyone passing by, I must have looked like a man at peace. But peace is not the absence of noise. It is the pause before you decide what comes next. The news of my resignation spread quickly through the business circles. Some called to offer polite sympathy, others to ask if I was planning to consult again. I gave them all the same answer: I am not sure yet. But in truth, I already knew. I had no intention of fading into quiet retirement. Men like Robert Mercer believe that time erases history. They were wrong. Time remembers. And I intended to make sure that when Springfield spoke of the Mercers, they also spoke of the man who made and unmade them. I began working out of a small office on the edge of town. Nothing grand, a two-room space above an old printing shop with sunlight that fell in warm stripes through the window blinds. I bought a plain desk, an old file cabinet, and a reliable coffee maker. That was all I needed. I called my old friend and former legal advisor from Chicago, Charles Whitmore, a man whose calm intellect could cut through any mess. He was one of the few people I trusted completely. I told him everything, from my years of sacrifice to the quiet betrayal that had ended it. Charles listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, "Sam, you already know what to do. You just need to make it official. Build your own." His advice was not just sound, it was permission. So, I did. Within a month, I registered Drayton and Associates, a consulting firm specializing in corporate restructuring and investment recovery. On paper, it looked like a modest local consultancy, but in truth, it was a strategic weapon. Every network I had built over 30 years, every investor I had once advised, every partner who had trusted my judgment more than Robert's, I reached out to them one by one. I did not ask for their loyalty. I earned it again quietly. Most responded with warmth, a few with hesitation, but one by one, the calls turned into contracts. I was no longer saving another man's legacy. I was building my own. Meanwhile, inside Mercer Group, the inevitable cracks had begun to show. My absence revealed the gaps no one else knew how to fill. I heard whispers from former colleagues, payment delays, disorganized projects, and contractors threatening to pull out. The numbers had begun to betray them. Without the system I had designed, their financial foundation was crumbling faster than they could patch it. Still, Robert refused to admit fault. He told the press everything was fine. Nathan gave speeches about innovation and youthful leadership. They were too blind to see they were already sinking. Eleanor came to visit me one evening. She looked tired, her eyes lined with worry. "Father is struggling, Sam," she said quietly. "The company is under pressure. The banks are tightening credit." I poured her tea, said nothing, and let her talk. She continued, "Nathan thinks some of your systems are still needed. He asked if you would consider returning as a consultant." I smiled faintly. "Your father made it very clear that my time was over," I said. "What would be the point of returning to rebuild something I know will only be taken apart again?" She looked at me then, her expression full of a sadness I could not name. "You cannot hold on to resentment forever," she whispered. "It will destroy you." I replied gently, "It is not resentment, Eleanor. It is memory." After she left, I sat in silence for a long time. Her visit stirred something I had buried deep, not love, but nostalgia for a time when loyalty still meant something. Yet I also knew that in her heart, she would always be a Mercer first. That night, I made a decision. I would not destroy them out of vengeance. I would let their own arrogance do it for me. All I needed to do was prepare the world for what would happen when they fell. Over the following months, Drayton and Associates grew. My name began to circulate quietly among investors who had once done business with Mercer Group. They called not out of curiosity, but trust. "Sam," one of them said over a phone call, "you were the only reason we worked with them in the first place. If you are back in the game, we will follow you." That became the pattern. For every client who left Mercer Group, another contract appeared on my desk. I did not chase them. They came willingly, guided by the simple truth that integrity never needs advertisement. By the second year, Mercer Group's decline was impossible to hide. The press began asking questions. A few business journals hinted at internal mismanagement. Nathan responded with bravado, blaming unforeseen market changes. Robert continued to posture as the visionary patriarch, even as he watched unpaid invoices pile up. And then came the article that changed everything. The Springfield Business Review published a story titled, "The Mercer Mirage: How Leadership Lost Its Foundation." The piece was brutal, detailing the company's financial instability, the exodus of clients, and the mysterious success of my new firm. The author had spoken with several former employees, people who remembered the real architect behind the Mercer turnaround. My name was in print again, and this time it stood alone. When the article reached Robert, he lost control. I knew this because Margaret, my old assistant who still worked there, called me that evening. Her voice trembled as she said, "He smashed a glass against the wall, Sam. He blames you for everything. He says you planted that article." I told her calmly, "No, Margaret, I did not plant anything. I only built the truth, and now it is speaking for itself." In the following weeks, the fallout intensified. Major investors withdrew. Suppliers demanded immediate payment. The banks began to freeze extensions. Nathan tried to hold emergency meetings, but his confidence crumbled without substance. Robert's pride, the same pride that had made him blind to everything but his family's name, became his greatest enemy. He refused to reach out, refused to admit that his empire had been held together not by blood, but by the man they had discarded. Then one morning, as I was reviewing new client reports at my modest office, Margaret appeared at my door. I had not seen her in months. She looked exhausted. "Mr. Drayton," she said softly, "they are falling apart. Robert will not say it, but they are desperate. Nathan cannot control the investors. They are losing everything." I listened quietly, offering her a chair. "I am sorry to hear that," I said. "No one deserves to lose what they love." She nodded. "They keep saying your name," she whispered. "In meetings, in calls, in interviews. It is like you never left." I smiled at that. "That is because I never truly did," I replied. "My work stayed long after I was gone." She hesitated, then asked, "If they come to you for help, would you take them back?" I looked out the window for a moment before answering, only to remind them what it costs to forget the man who saved them. When people speak of retaliation, they imagine loud acts, newspapers, and courtroom drama. That is not my way. I had spent a lifetime moving numbers and people with quiet precision. I knew that the cleanest victories were those that arrived like inevitability, the ones that required little theater because the facts themselves did the work. So I turned my attention to the parts of the company that could not be stripped away by a family name or rewritten in a speech. First, I secured the rights to the intellectual work I had created, not by theft, but by design. Years earlier, I had been careful to tie certain proprietary financial models and operational protocols to my consulting agreements through clauses that were easy to miss on a cursory read, but ironclad under legal inspection. I had reserved limited transfer rights and explicit ownership of the models that optimized project financing and cash flow management. Those documents were now tucked behind multiple layers of legal protection, held by a trust and monitored by Charles Whitmore, who had already begun drafting defensive filings and notices that would activate if anyone attempted to move those assets without consensus. At the same time, I reached out quietly to the key partners and clients who had trusted me when Mercer Group was a liability instead of a name. I did not beg. I reminded them, plainly, of the commitments I had kept and the results those commitments produced. A few picked up the phone with warmth, others with caution, but many listened. Trust built over decades does not vanish because a press release says it should. Contracts were renegotiated with my new firm, Drayton and Associates, and where possible, I structured agreements so that certain projects could be administered by us if the original arrangements at Mercer faltered. That was not spite. That was responsibility. I had always believed that a company was more than a sign on a building. It was the people whose paychecks depended on steady work. And if those people stood to be injured by reckless leadership, I would act. While rebuilding a client base, I also fortified my position in the financial corridors that mattered. I arranged lines of credit for Drayton and Associates, not lavish ones, but sufficient to fund operations and seize opportunities that required immediate capital. I did not want to be at the mercy of the same banks who now watched Mercer Group with narrowed eyes. Charles called in favors from contacts he had worked with for decades. Those conversations were not dramatic. They were professional. They consisted of quiet statements of fact, confirmations of my track record, and agreements that would allow my firm to underwrite short-term commitments where necessary. Money in itself was not the point. The point was that I would have the ability to act quickly, to sign a contract the day an investor asked for a reliable partner. Speed matters in business. When others scramble, the prepared look decisive. At the center of my plan, though, were people. Margaret remained a steady presence, and a few senior managers who had left Mercer reached out with the same question: "Can we come work with you?" Each time I said yes. I hired them not only for skill but for memory. These were people who knew which invoices had been mishandled, which subcontractor had been pushed aside, and which projects were masks for cash flow problems. Their testimonies, recorded and documented, would not make for sensational headlines on their own, but they would be a foundation for honesty in any due diligence a potential investor required. I also cultivated a small team of young analysts who admired careful work over flashy promises. They were not showmen. They were craftsmen. I taught them how to read a balance sheet the way a mechanic reads an engine. When Nathan made broad claims about innovation, my team could point to where the engine seized under his watch. Another move required legal foresight. I placed confidential notices with several major clients indicating that certain project deliverables were contingent upon adherence to the original performance standards outlined under the agreements that I had influenced. Those notices were dry, formal, and effective because they reminded the clients that change in leadership could constitute material change to the agreement. In plain language, they meant that if Mercer Group could not produce the same results, clients had both the right and the duty to seek alternatives. That planted a quiet seed of doubt in the minds of companies that had once accepted Mercer's public assurances. Doubt in business is contagious. I also prepared a modest public strategy, though I abhorred spectacle. I asked Charles to draft an op-ed that I would not publish initially, a clear account of the work done to stabilize Mercer Group years ago and the facts surrounding its rise. It was not an exercise in revenge. It was a document intended for the record, a precise timeline of actions with supporting documentation that could be used by any journalist seeking clarity should the need arise. Having that piece ready meant the truth would not be a rumor in the hands of gossip. It would be anchored, dated, and provable. Above all, I held to a simple principle: act where it matters, and avoid temptation elsewhere. There were nights when a different path seemed attractive, a public collapse orchestrated for maximal shame. I rejected that. I did not want people ruined on stage. I wanted them faced with the consequences of decisions, plain and unavoidable. When leaders choose ego over diligence, the arithmetic of business does the heavy lifting. Contracts break, lenders withdraw, projects halt. Those were the mechanisms I let unfold. I set my firm in a position to hire displaced employees, to take on stalled projects with credible financing, and to give vendors and tradesmen the steady payments they needed. In doing so, I created a parallel trust network of commerce that would absorb the shock of Mercer Group's missteps while restoring steady work to the town that had been left exposed by poor judgment. Throughout this time, I kept my guard. I continued to archive correspondence, to timestamp agreements, and to log every conversation that could matter later. I never once contemplated personal humiliation as a goal. I aimed to prevent further harm and to show, without melodrama, how quickly pride can undo what patience and competence build. Eleanor learned some of this in pieces. She came by the office occasionally, and we spoke quietly about the practicalities rather than the past. She would apologize in the small, careful way someone does when they must admit they were wrong. I listened, accepted the apology in the same quiet manner I had accepted her love years ago, and moved forward. By the time winter returned and the maples were bare, Drayton and Associates had a modest roster of projects and a reputation for steady delivery. The first large test came when a regional energy firm, one that had once hesitated to commit to Mercer Group without my oversight, called my number and said plainly, "We need a partner who will see this through. Can you do it?" I answered without flourish, "Yes." That one word started a chain that would change everything. It was proof that facts, when properly marshaled, have their own authority. I had not sought a dramatic vindication. I had prepared, documented, and waited. The world responded to readiness, not to anger. What no one tells you about betrayal is how quiet it becomes once it finishes its work. There is no thunder, no final argument that clarifies what went wrong. One day you simply wake up and realize the people who once called you family have already replaced you in their conversations. As if you were a chapter from a book they no longer wish to remember. I learned this one morning in early spring when I opened the newspaper and saw a photograph of Robert Mercer and his son Nathan standing proudly beside a half-completed commercial tower in downtown Springfield. The headline read, "Mercer Group expands into urban development. The next generation leads the way." In the article, Nathan was quoted saying, "Our family's legacy continues to shape this region's future." My name did not appear once. I had expected this, yet seeing it printed in black and white made the truth harder to ignore. I had not been written out by chance. I had been erased by design. I went about my day without reaction. At my office, Charles had already read the article. He handed me a copy and said, "It reads like a eulogy." I smiled faintly, then let them bury themselves with it. Beneath the surface, however, I felt the unmistakable weight of something darker. The Mercers were no longer content with my absence. They wanted to turn it into a story of their own making. Within weeks, I began hearing from mutual associates that Robert had been hinting I had moved on gracefully after financial disagreements. Nathan went further. He suggested in certain circles that I had been overcautious, even an obstacle to progress. Those whispers spread faster than any truth. They reached boardrooms, coffee shops, and even charity galas, where Springfield's elite congratulated one another on the myth of the Mercer vision. At first, I ignored it. I told myself that small men need stories to survive. But then, one afternoon, Margaret called me sounding shaken. "Mr. Drayton," she said quietly, "they are reviewing old contracts. I think they are trying to pin something on you." Her words were like a cold wind. I knew Robert's pride would never allow him to admit failure. If the company's numbers began to falter, he would look for someone to blame. And who better than the man already painted as an outsider who left under mysterious circumstances? I told Margaret to stay calm and to forward nothing, to speak to no one about our conversation. After the call, I sat for a long time staring at the framed document on my wall, my father's old workshop license. It reminded me of what he had once told me. Son, when a man forgets gratitude, he becomes a danger to everyone around him. Robert had reached that point. I called Charles that evening and told him to move ahead with filing all intellectual property protections we had discussed months earlier. He responded, "Do you think they will try to challenge ownership?" I said, "Not think, Charles. I know." Within a week, we had legal notices prepared and quietly delivered to multiple stakeholders, clarifying the proprietary nature of the systems I had created. It was not an act of aggression. It was a shield. Still, I knew this was only the beginning of a much larger storm. Robert's pride could not coexist with documentation that proved I was the architect behind his empire. For him, history had to be rewritten, and I was the obstacle standing in the way. Meanwhile, Drayton and Associates continued to grow. The regional energy project we had secured months earlier began showing strong results. Our clients were pleased, our reports clean, our performance transparent. Each week brought another quiet victory, and with every success, Mercer Group's decline became more visible. They had overextended themselves financially, pouring millions into projects without securing proper risk mitigation. Suppliers complained of unpaid invoices. 2 banks downgraded their creditworthiness. Still, Robert persisted in public optimism, while Nathan posted photos of luxury cars and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. I did not need to intervene. They were building their own downfall with the same arrogance that had driven me out. Then came the meeting I had both expected and dreaded. Eleanor appeared at my office late one afternoon, unannounced. She looked tired, her face lined with the strain of months of internal conflict. She closed the door behind her and said, "Father and Nathan believe you are trying to ruin us." Her voice trembled slightly. "They say you are influencing clients, spreading doubt, and manipulating investors." I sat back, keeping my voice even. "Eleanor, I have done nothing except my work. Their downfall is their own creation." She nodded weakly. "I know, but they will not see it that way. They are planning something. I do not know what, but Nathan has been meeting with lawyers in St. Louis. Father told me he wants to settle unfinished business." For a long time, neither of us spoke. When she finally met my eyes, I saw regret there. Perhaps too late to mean anything. "You could stop this," she whispered. "Come back. Help them. Make peace before everything falls apart." I shook my head slowly. "You cannot make peace with those who mistake loyalty for servitude." She started to speak again, but I raised my hand gently. "Go home, Eleanor. Tell your father I wish him well." After she left, the office felt smaller. For the first time in years, I realized how much of my life had been tied to her. Not in love anymore, but in memory. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window, watching dusk settle over the town I had helped build. Somewhere out there, the Mercers were preparing their final betrayal. But I was no longer the man they could ambush. Every file, every signature, every piece of evidence of my work was documented and ready. They could not rewrite what was already recorded in truth. 2 weeks later, the attack came. I received a formal letter from a law firm representing Mercer Group. The language was predictably polished. "Mercer Group is initiating a review of prior contractual obligations related to proprietary systems developed under advisory capacity by Mr. Samuel Drayton. The company reserves the right to claim ownership where applicable. Charles read it and laughed dryly. "They are fishing," he said. "They know those rights are yours." I nodded. They will not find what they are looking for, but they will learn what it costs to provoke me. From that day, my retaliation was no longer theoretical. It became action grounded in evidence and law. I authorized Charles to begin proceedings confirming ownership of every system I had designed, every financial model I had introduced, every strategic framework that had lifted their company from insolvency. We filed quietly but decisively. The filings were public record. Within days, business reporters began noticing. Headlines appeared, subtle but significant. Dispute over Mercer Group's proprietary assets raises questions about leadership. I did not give statements. I did not need to. The documentation spoke for itself. When the Mercers realized what had happened, their panic was palpable. Margaret, still working within the firm, called me one evening. "They are in chaos," she said. "Robert's shouting, Nathan's blaming everyone. Clients are asking for explanations, and no one can give them straight answers." I thanked her and hung up, feeling no joy, only a quiet inevitability. Betrayal had come full circle. They had tried to erase me, but in the process, they had erased their own credibility. The night after the filings became public, I received a call I did not expect. It was Eleanor. Her voice was low, almost broken. "Father wants to meet," she said. "He is different. He says he wants to speak to you face to face." I paused for a long moment before answering. "Tell him I will hear him, but not on his terms. He will come to my office." She hesitated. "He will not like that." I replied quietly, "Then he does not need to come." Robert Mercer arrived at my office 2 mornings later, his pride wrapped in a dark overcoat. For a man once celebrated in front of cameras, he looked smaller now, his shoulders drawn inward, his hair more silver than gray. He entered without greeting, scanning the modest office as if trying to reconcile its simplicity with the man who had undone his empire. I gestured toward the chair opposite my desk. "Robert," I said evenly, "you wanted to speak." He sat, his jaw set, his voice clipped. "You think you can humiliate me in front of this town, after everything my family gave you?" I met his glare with calm. "You mean the years I gave your company, the wealth I created, the life I postponed? That is what we are talking about." He slammed his hand against the armrest. "You signed contracts as an advisor. You were compensated. You have no right to claim our work as yours." I leaned forward slightly. "Then you have not read those contracts, Robert. You have only read what you wanted to see. The systems I built were under personal license. Every investor, every client knows this now. I took nothing. I only ensured the truth had a place to stand." For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence between us carried years of resentment, years of unspoken acknowledgement. Finally, he exhaled heavily, the weight of exhaustion sinking into his frame. "We are collapsing," he admitted. "The banks are closing in, investors have withdrawn, and Nathan, he blames everyone but himself." He rubbed his temple and looked at me. "Help me fix this, Sam. We can rebuild. I will make it right." For the first time in years, I saw something human in him. Not regret, but desperation. Yet it came far too late. "I warned you about this," I said softly. "You built an empire on ego. I cannot fix that." He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. Eleanor was right, he murmured. You always had more strength than any of us. He stood slowly, his voice lower now. Do not think this makes you the better man, Sam. You only win because you have nothing left to lose. I rose to meet his eyes. No, Robert. I win because I learned when to let go. He left without another word. I watched him walk down the narrow hall, a man chasing the echo of a legacy he could no longer control. That meeting marked the end of any illusion that reconciliation was possible. I did not celebrate. I returned to my desk, poured myself a glass of water, and called Charles. It has started, I told him. Now let it run its course. In the weeks that followed, the collapse of Mercer Group became a slow unraveling. Contractors abandoned projects, shareholders filed complaints, and the press swarmed. I did nothing but continue my work. Drayton and Associates quietly absorbed smaller firms, hiring those displaced by the Mercers' mismanagement. The same men and women Robert had ignored now found their paychecks signed by me. I never once mentioned his name. I did not need to. In business, silence can be louder than revenge. By the time summer came, Mercer Group was on the brink of bankruptcy. The empire Robert had once paraded before the world was nothing but unpaid bills and hollow promises. And I, the man they had once erased, stood not as their destroyer, but as their replacement. By the time autumn returned, the Mercer Empire no longer existed. What had once been a proud network of contracts, investors, and government partnerships was now a collection of lawsuits and abandoned projects. The press did not call it a collapse. They called it a reckoning. Reports filled the business pages, tracing the fall from ambition to arrogance. One line from the Midwest Financial Review stayed with me. Mercer Group's failure was not due to market pressure, but to the erosion of integrity within its leadership. Those words struck deeper than any court ruling. They were the epitaph of a dynasty that had forgotten its foundation. Robert retreated from public life. Rumors said he sold his mansion, moved into a smaller property by the edge of town, and spent his days writing letters no one read. Nathan vanished altogether. A contact at the bank later told me he had fled to Europe after siphoning what remained of the company's reserves into private accounts. Even that betrayal failed to shock me. The boy had learned well from the father. When pride is passed down as inheritance, it leaves no room for conscience. As for Eleanor, she sent me a single letter, 4 pages written in her graceful, careful hand. She confessed that she had divorced her husband years after I left, that she had stayed by her father's side until there was nothing left to defend, and that now she lived alone, teaching art at a small college nearby. Her words were full of regret, but not self-pity. You were right, Samuel, she wrote. Loyalty without honesty is only another form of cowardice. I hope you have found peace. I read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in my drawer. I did not reply. Some words do not need to travel backward in time. Meanwhile, Drayton and Associates thrived. We had grown from a modest office into a regional firm with clients across 3 states. The same energy companies that had once praised Robert's vision now sought my advice on sustainable expansion. I kept the office modest, the work precise, and my name out of headlines. I did not need fame. I needed continuity, reliability, and truth. The people who worked for me, many of them former Mercer employees, understood that. They did not see me as a hero or a savior. They saw me as a man who kept his word. Occasionally, I would walk past the old Mercer building. The sign had been taken down, replaced by a modest banner bearing the name of a small architecture firm. The glass doors were streaked with dust. The fountain outside, once lit by golden spotlights, had gone dry. Standing there, I felt neither triumph nor nostalgia, only completion. The story had come full circle. I had built their success, they had built my resolve, and time had evened the score without my lifting a finger. One evening, Charles called me with a hint of irony in his voice. "Did you hear? The court finalized the Mercer bankruptcy today." I asked him what Robert would do now. "Probably nothing," Charles said. "Some men cannot live without their titles." I thanked him and ended the call. That night, I poured myself a drink, not to celebrate, but to remember. In the amber glow of the glass, I saw every sacrifice I had made, career, love, youth, and realized that none of it had been in vain. Because in losing everything temporary, I had reclaimed what lasts, my integrity. Now, years later, I sit on the porch of my home as the evening sun settles over the fields, its light spilling across the horizon like a soft farewell. I am 65, and though my hair has thinned and my hands bear the quiet tremor of age, I have never felt stronger. People often assume strength is the absence of loss. They are wrong. Strength is what remains when loss has finished its work. I built, I fell, and I built again. But this time, I built with peace instead of pride. Drayton and Associates continues under younger hands now. I still visit the office twice a week, not as an owner, but as an advisor. I watch the new generation handle clients with confidence, their eyes bright with purpose. They often ask me about my past, about the empire that once was. I never speak in bitterness. I simply tell them this: never build anything on someone else's gratitude. Build on your own discipline. They usually nod politely, not yet understanding, but one day they will. I sometimes see Margaret, now retired, when she drops by for coffee. We speak of the old days, of long nights at the office, and of names that have long faded from the town's memory. Once she said softly, "You never took revenge, Mr. Drayton. You just let truth do the work." I smiled at that, because she was right. My story had never been about revenge. It was about survival with dignity intact. There is a difference between striking back and standing firm. One feeds anger, the other feeds the soul. Eleanor wrote me again last year. The envelope came without a return address, just her familiar handwriting. She said she had found some peace, that she still painted sunsets and taught students who reminded her of the hopeful girl she once was. She ended the letter with a line that stayed with me. "I hope you look at the sky sometimes and think of what could have been, but also what was saved." I did not respond, but I folded that letter beside the first. Forgiveness is not always spoken. Sometimes it lives quietly in the choice to move forward. Every now and then, someone from the business community stops me on the street. They still remember my name, though the world has moved on to younger success stories. They ask if I ever regret it all. Leaving Chicago, saving the Mercer family, losing what I built. I always answer the same. Regret belongs to those who stopped learning. Because what I gained could not be measured in contracts or awards. It was the understanding that integrity, once tested, either breaks or becomes unbreakable. Mine became the latter. In the silence of these later years, I have discovered that peace is not the absence of noise, but the absence of deceit. I wake each morning knowing no one can twist my name to their narrative again. And when I watch the sunset, I think not of Robert, Nathan, or even Eleanor. I think of the man I once was, the one who believed sacrifice was weakness. He was wrong. Sacrifice, when made for what is right, becomes the foundation of every lasting victory. I have outlived my enemies, but more importantly, I have outlived my anger. And in that quiet victory lies the kind of wealth that no empire, no inheritance, and no betrayal can ever take away. If you liked this story, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if your family betrayed you like this? To hear the next one, click on the box on the screen. Another tale of betrayal, justice, and redemption is waiting for you.